welcome everybody to our probably inaugural Environment Exchange online. These are certainly unusual and challenging times, but we've all discovered things about ourselves that we didn't know that we could do before, and hosting a Zoom meeting with close to 50 people is something I've never done before, so we'll see how we go. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Helen Oakey. I'm the Executive Director of the Conservation Council, the ACT region. I do know many of the names that have popped up on the screen. It would be great to see you all. We could try that in the question section and see how we travel and just see how the bandwidth copes. But it's great to see all of your names there anyway. We've had an overwhelming amount of interest in tonight's presentation, which was originally going to be held live at the ANU. I'm not sure if we've got more people because you can do it in the comfort of your own home, or whether we would have had the same amount of people, but I do know that people who care about the environment from right across the region are deeply interested about what's happened in Namadgi over the last couple of months, and deeply interested to find out what the impacts have been of the bushfire that was down there and what the plans are for recovery. Unfortunately, Justin Foley, who was going to be sharing this presentation with Ian, is unable to be here tonight. I think we're all conscious that all of our plans have changed over the last few weeks with the COVID-19 impacts on our families and our work and our jobs. And so unfortunately, he's unable to be here. But we're very grateful to have Ian Walker, who is the Conservator, as well as the head of the Environment Division of EPSDD, the Environment Planning Sustainable Development Directorate. And we thank you for your time, Ian, for coming along tonight. I think Ian's in the office all by himself tonight. Everyone else is working from home, and so they should be at home anyway by this time. But it would have been great to have had you in person, but we've managed to score the technology so that we can follow the PowerPoint on the Zoom meeting. We've now got 43 people in the room, so I think we'll probably get started, and I'm going to hand over to Ian. But before I do, I just want to quickly review some of the logistics of using Zoom, the Zoom platform. So what we're going to do is Ian's going to run through a presentation, which will probably take us about half an hour. If you have any questions of clarification during the presentation, or any questions at all, if you can pop them into the chat sidebar, I will keep an eye on the questions there. If they seem like they're clarification questions, I'll try to interrupt Ian and put them to him during the presentation. Otherwise, we'll try to come back to questions at the end. I think that would just be a whole lot easier in this format to do it that way around. When we come to questions at the end, there are a number of ways that we can do that, and I will flick between those ways. But preferably, you can put a question into the chat bar. You can put into the chat bar that you would like to ask a question, or you can do what's called raising your hand in the meeting, which I think is a feature that you can click on if you go to Manage Participants, and you'll have a list and you can raise your hand and a little blue hand will come up. I apologise in advance if my dog starts barking. I should try to keep my mute button on so that you're not all interrupted. And we'll just try and make it work as best we can. And we might, at the beginning of the question section, just see if people can put their videos on when we get to the end of the presentation. And if you go into, not speaker view, but if you go into gallery view, once the presentation's down and you go into gallery view and we all put our videos on, then we should be able to take a look around the room, which would just be a nice thing to do, and see if it works from there. So I'm going to hand over to Ian now. And turn my mute button on, but if you do need to communicate with me, just use the chat function on the side. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks, Helen. I'm assuming people can see both my head and the first slide of the presentation.
Yep.
Beautiful. Thanks, thanks, Helen. Welcome, everyone. We are in unusual times, and I think Helen's highlighted just, I guess, the novel approach of doing this video conference to some 43 people is certainly a new experience for me. just for, I guess, a little bit of context, many of my staff across the environment portfolio are also working from home and connecting to us virtually as well. So most of my meetings today have been in this exact type of format. So we're certainly adapting and coming to terms with what this all means. One of the other things that strikes me in this process is I don't get the visual clues from my audience, whether they're falling asleep or grimacing or shouting or ecstatic about what's being said. So if at any time you are nodding off, please, I guess, raise your hand or yell out so I can try and make sure I wake everyone up. On that note, I might kick off with, what was that, Helen?
I said, this is me clapping. See? We can
I
react.
do like Dom in the background too. All right. I'll kick off with the slide presentation, and as Helen said, we'll both try and keep an eye on the questions that people are asking. And if you can't see the slides, then we'll see how we go. So let me start by acknowledging the traditional custodians, the Ngunnawal people, and pay respects to elders past and present, and recognise the significant role that community has played in shaping the country that we're on here in the ACT and across Australia. With over tens of thousands of years of history in managing country, the Ngunnawal people have a particularly important role in how we progress and work through our recovery program. So I always want to make sure that we recognise that and go forward from there. And that didn't quite work. Let's try that again. Pretty much just touched on that bit. We know that fire's been a long part of the Australian and the ACT landscape, and we know that traditional custodians have used fire for tens of thousands of years, and we also understand that fire has shaped and evolved and adapted the way that the environment is currently and how it will also change into the future. We know that fire is an integral part of the Australian ecosystems. It really drives evolution around both of our flora and fauna. And we also know that our plants and our animals are very reliant on fire to trigger life cycle changes, to provide diversity of resources at different times, and to provide a structural diversity and structural habitat changes. We know that plants are very much adapted to fire. They resprout, they seed, they regenerate based on fire. We know and understand all of those elements, and we certainly recognise that as those things occur, animals come in and respond to those very issues. So I guess this is an important element for us to have up front before we start talking about fire recovery, recognising that nature in itself has evolved, has adapted to fire in the landscape, and it has many adaptations to support that change. The couple of pieces of terminology that fire ecologists, land managers and others use that want to just make sure we're all on the same page with. One's around fire regimes. And fire regimes really are about influencing how plants and animals respond. And fire regimes are often spoken about in terms of their frequency, how often they occur, how hot they are, as in intensity, what season they occur in, and the type of fire that occurs across the landscape. That can be seen on the map on your screen, showing the different age classes that we have across the ACT in terms of how fire has occurred over time. We also recognise that there's another, I guess, concept here around fire mosaics. or as the slide says, patchiness. So we want to establish patches of burnt, unburnt areas across the landscape. And in managing fire, that's what we seek to achieve. It's an important element to get our heads around, that we want these areas of unburnt areas to provide refugia, to provide connectivity, to allow animals and plants to survive in the landscape, to then move out from those unburnt areas and repopulate other areas that have been burnt. And they also provide this important aspect of habitat structure. All of that being said, I guess we're now in unprecedented times. So not only here and now dealing with COVID-19, but also recognising that climate change is changing how our environment is responding and how we're needing to deal with a number of things. On the screen, and many of you will have seen this, is the snapshot out of the climate change strategy that talks about extreme weather events, from heat waves, we've had some of those this year, to droughts, which we've been in over the last number of years, to more intense storms, e.g. hailstorms, to significant bushfires, as we've seen across Australia this year. So we're certainly seeing the implications of a warming climate and a changing climate through these extreme weather events. Our challenge is, how do we recognise that? How do we ensure that we maintain mosaics in the landscape and the fire regimes within that landscape, knowing that we're probably likely to see more frequent fires and therefore a change in the regimes across not only the ACT, but more broadly the country. So going from that sort of broad level down to, okay, so what's happened at Orroral Valley? We know that we had a fire of about 87,000 hectares. The total fire edge was around 230 kilometres, and that's important to understand in terms of recovery. We know that about 80% of Namadgi was burnt and about 22% of Tidbinbilla was also burnt. In addition, some areas around the park and rural landholders were also impacted. So it's important to understand, yes, that's the total fire extent, but how was that fire, how did that fire occur across the landscape? Did it burn hot, cold, intermittently, in patches? What did that look like? And that's a really important step in understanding, okay, how do we respond to these fire events? Bear in mind, this fire was also in play. Sorry if people heard that, that was my phone ringing. Common trap for presenting at normal meetings, let alone on a video conference call. This map was really just trying to show that this is the fire extent here in the ACT, but as you can see, to the west and to the east, other fires were also occurring in New South Wales at the time. So we had significant fire events across the country. And that's a really important context to understand what that means and how do we respond and what's important for us to respond to in the ACT. The first step we undertook in responding to the fire while the fire was still going. So it's a credit to ESA and Georgina and the incident controller, Neil Cooper, who facilitated the establishment of what's called a rapid risk assessment team. I think Margaret's on the video conference. I think I saw her name appear somewhere on the screen. Margaret Kitchen led the team that you see on the screen. Margaret has had previous experience working in different jurisdictions, undertaking rapid risk assessments. And as the name says, it is a rapid assessment, really to try and get a handle on fire extent and the impact that the fire has had on the landscape, and to prioritise work or activities that need to occur. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The reason for the people, we wanted to demonstrate that this is a multidiscipline team, people with fire ecology expertise, an archaeologist, an ecologist, a botanist, people with asset management expertise. So quite a diverse group of people that are engaged in this initial rapid risk assessment at a time when the fire was not contained and not controlled. This group was tasked in ESA to really get the first step done, which was the rapid risk assessment. A key component of the rapid risk assessment was undertaking fire severity mapping. So the team, led by Margaret, undertook the fire severity mapping, and you can see the map on the screen showing the level of severity. The darker the red, the more extreme in terms of severity. Now to really test the video facilities, we'll see if we can do a little bit of a fly through, so bear with me and we'll see how this goes. Helen, if this doesn't work, yell out.
Not working so far. Oh yeah, here you go.
We're happening. People.
Something's happening.
This is this is the fly through of landscape with the severity being laid over it through the more and satellite real level severity of fire. We're just flying over the top of Janine's there. The pins representing target lines, so I put target lines to try our land.
So Ian, I think the video playing is making you sound pretty awful. Can you understand what I'm saying? No, this is what you sound like. Okay.
I'll wait till it is.
Okay, hang on. The video is killing the sound.
So hopefully you can now hear me again. What that was a fly through of the fire ground, showing the severity map. Was also shown there, so obviously the darker the colour, the darker the orange, the darker the hotter the fire. So what you could see was that the fire wasn't uniform across the landscape. It burnt hot through the valley and up some of the slopes, and cooler down other sides of the slopes. It also highlighted on those pink lines where retardant drops occurred. And I did mention as we were flying over Ramsar wetlands, the preventative measures put in place there to try and protect those wetlands from burning. That didn't work. Try that again. So I'm going to step through a couple of photos and also just talk to the photos a little bit as well, just so that people get an understanding of the situation, and then step to where we've got to and what our current activities are. So this photo is just showing the intensity of the fire, clearly some scorching of the crown and travelling across the town, the crown as it's running up slope. some particular pyro generated cloud. And this is an important context for how the fire spread into New South Wales. So that hot mass developed early on in the fire and then progressed and moved over New South Wales and actually collapsed in New South Wales. So that's when we had the fires in New South Wales kick off. This image, I guess, really goes to demonstrate the patchiness of the burn and the intensity of the burn. So you see, and I won't be able to point to it, I don't think, the lower edge of the screen, very hot burn, not much canopy left, and you can see the ground. Other areas, less intense fire, and in some areas, no fire. It's also important to note, and given the dry conditions that we've experienced, many of the trees in the landscape also had significant browning and loss of foliage as a consequence of the very dry conditions. During the fire event, it was actually quite difficult in smoky and somewhat hard to see conditions, whether the fire had actually travelled through the landscape or was actually an implication of the dry conditions. And again, coming down into our catchments, you can see, again, some patchiness of burn, and I guess really emphasising that fire doesn't burn uniformly through the landscape. A couple more showing the same sorts of images. Not only are we talking about the ecological catchment values of the landscape, we also have a range of heritage values, whether they be European heritage or significant Aboriginal cultural heritage. During the fire, and this image shows a couple of things, we're able to put control lines, mineral earth breaks around particular heritage values. So they were deployed prior to the fire. In the background, in the distant background, you can see where the fire's come down. In the middle ground, you can see a slightly tinged pinky colour. So again, this is the retardant that's been laid in the landscape. So I guess a demonstration of the sort of mitigation fire management strategies that are deployed during a fire. Ian Falconer on the video call as well. Ian, this one will be of particular interest to you. You can see significant amount of ash and nutrients and various other soil sludge entering waterways and catchments across the fire ground. I had the good fortune of being out there fairly soon after the fire had passed, and it was pleasing to see that the water had cleared. So despite initial large amount of sediment and nutrient going into the waterways and creeks and areas, the water had actually cleared, and that transition occurred very quickly after the fire. So like I said at the front end of this presentation, this is a natural process where we do see this large sludge of material entering the catchment and entering our creeks and waterways. It clears very quickly and we end up with, I guess, a new environment being established. One of the key areas that has been impacted, and one of the key threatened communities across the ACT, is our bogs and fens. So you can see here the impact of the fire on the bogs and fens. This will come up in a slightly next couple of slides about where we're heading and our strategies going forward. I've mentioned Aboriginal cultural sites. So we have I guess, identified Aboriginal cultural heritage across the landscape, and in many cases, we'd put mitigation strategies in place before the fire arrived. So at Yankee Hat, for example, we removed the timber boardwalk from around the art site. For obvious reasons, we didn't want that to catch fire and impact on the art site. So that mitigation helped. Many scar trees, we also put control lines around, or other rock art sites also put control lines aligned to prevent the fire moving into that landscape and impacting those sites. I've already mentioned on sediment and movement of material. You can see this happening fairly quickly straight after the fire. We've had my experience in both the Victorian fires and the significant Victorian fires. Almost immediately after those fires, we ended up with a significant rainfall event, as we did here. And so you do see a large movement of soil and material through the landscape. Again, small erosion areas occurring because of that loss of protective vegetation. Again, same sort of thing, movement of soil. This is a common feature of fires. What we're trying to avoid here is where we, through our fire management activities, have inadvertently caused these erosion or this movement of soil. So one of the key strategies to prevent impact is to avoid having, this might sound straightforward, having dozer lines or other control lines going through creeks or other areas which would funnel more sediment into these sorts of areas. And you can see here's a good example of the very thing that I was just talking about. This is actually a road, and the sediment from the hill on the side has basically formed a new surface for that road. Not a very good surface, but a new surface nonetheless. The pleasing thing though, I think, very soon after the fire, we are and have seen the emergence of growth, and the rain, while it has caused movement of soil, it has also reinvigorated the environment. So nature is very, very powerful in terms of how it responds and recovers from these sorts of things. So I guess this image really just gives a demonstration of our ability and our, not our ability, nature's ability to respond to the change in the landscape. And as I said, nature has adapted, it has evolved to do this very thing. In terms of the rapid risk assessment, I just wanted to cover a couple of key components and key things in that space. So the risk assessment is online, so people can access it online, but I'll just highlight a couple of key points. As I said earlier, multidiscipline team, they identified 27 risks and treatments, 9 of them extreme, 14 of them high. And you'll see they'll cover everything from biodiversity, ecological, through to cultural heritage, through to risks to roads and public safety, and also infrastructure. And I'm not going to read them all out so people can see them, I hope, on the screen. I've covered the extreme ones, and I'll go into a little more detail in a couple more slides. So the high ones sort of related to water quality and fish, risk to cultural heritage, particularly stone arrangements and archaeological sites, some water quality, hill slope erosion, and some assets. I'll just talk about briefly each of those key areas, and the rapid risk assessment was the vehicle by which this information was compiled and put together, and it forms the precursor of what is now the recovery program. So what we're saying here is we've identified 3 extreme risks around cultural heritage, being damage to Aboriginal rock art sites. So that means we're now out there looking and getting experts and traditional custodians and RAOs to look at those sites and assess what actions need to be undertaken, and then putting those actions into play. Damage to historic huts, so some huts, the one on the bottom of the screen, we had some 14 huts across Namadgi. We have 12 now standing. Obviously that means 2 were impacted, as you see there. The 12 that are still standing, the level of impact on those ranges from very little to needing assessment to determine what actions are needed to take for going forward. The other one, which is damage to, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I just had a request if you can identify where some of the sites are in the photos as you go through, if you're familiar with them.
I won't do that. I won't do that on this slide, particularly as it relates to the Aboriginal sites, and I'll provide that information.
Yeah, I think that was a general request. I think that was just a general request for photos, if you can.
Yep, can do.
Thanks.
So just on the dozer there, that was just to highlight that they're the sorts of earthworks that get put in to mitigate the fire and to slow the spread of the fire down. So a lot of earthworks were undertaken on road edges and adjacent to existing tracks to shore up those control lines. In doing so, that has and that does uncover a range of archaeological values, and they need to be, we need to determine what we do with those values when they're discovered. Excuse me, I was about to sneeze, it's gone away. And no, I don't have any issues with COVID-19. So flooding and erosion was identified as a key risk, and particularly, as I mentioned, on roads and walking tracks, because that's where they act as funnels and push nutrient sediments into other areas. We also identified a range of hill slopes that were particularly susceptible to erosion. So what the team did here was used a range of models and spatial information to identify those soils that were more susceptible to erosion, map that against the fire severity mapping, and then came up with a matrix to assess that work. One of the good things about where we are in the ACT is that we do have good habitat information about our vegetation communities and our soils. After the 2003 fires, EPSDD group that was chaired by Ian Falconer actually facilitated and developed a plan to respond to events like this fire, and identified critical areas that may need to be restored, protected in the event of a fire and post-fire. So that recovery plan was prepared in a way that you would then add the relevant fire information to get an assessment done using the standard risk assessment processes across government. So that work became particularly relevant in this flooding and erosion area. In the fauna context, the key risk is predation of threatened fauna, and that was particularly relevant for crayfish and also for our larger possums. And the key element there is clearly when you lose habitat and lose cover, species become more vulnerable to predation. And as Professor Lindemeyer said a couple of weeks ago, you know, cats and foxes move into these landscapes very quickly. So one of the key strategies is to ensure that we have suitable habitat and understand what species may or may not be impacted, and then implement a range of predator-based control programs. I'll leave that there. Flora context, very similar. So we know that we'll have, and we do have impacts on our bogs. Fortunately, our Ramsar wetland wasn't impacted, Giannini wetlands. However, we know that the fire again has opened up the landscape, and things like invasive plants will need to be managed, and we'll need to manage feral horses if they come into the ACT. So that particular shot of horses isn't ACT related, but it is high country related. I guess it's just there as illustration of the impact that horses may have, and the concentration of horses would occur into unburnt locations. Likewise with park infrastructure. So what we've been doing currently is trying to mitigate the impacts of trees on falling onto roads. So there's been an extensive program to remove dangerous trees across the fireground where that's relevant to people. Likewise, burnt infrastructure that was put in place, how do we repair or put back that infrastructure? Important element in consideration of that is if we have a wooden boardwalk, as I'd mentioned around Yankee Hat, do we put a boardwalk back? First question. Second question, what's the boardwalk built out of, and how do we respond to that? So that's really a bit of a snapshot of the recovery work around the RATS program. I'll talk to now where we currently are and the work currently under play. I won't step through any more slides, but I just wanted to highlight where we're up to as of today. So we've established a recovery program, and that's being led by Peter Kotzel. So a number of you will know Pete. He's working across, again, we've formed a multidiscipline team, and they've gone through the rapid risk assessment report and are now compiling a range of project plans that describe the activity and work and budget and tasks that need to be undertaken. So that's at the planning programming level. At the operational doing level, we've had our teams out on the ground mitigating tree risk and providing safe access to people to assess the landscape. So that's been an important step of getting people out there. We've commenced our work around particular areas where we've had erosion and putting core logs into those areas and mitigating further erosion potential. And we've also assessed our boundary for where we need to replace fences. So one of the key things there is our rural landholders who have stock, we need to make sure that they're not, they're staying on their property and not moving into the park. So there are a couple of, I guess, the key things that we've got in terms of on ground, but recognising that there's also been a considerable amount of project planning and identification of the risk, and then what strategies we need to put in place to do that, and the commencement of fundamentally the recruiting of those experts to undertake that work. Under the COVID-19 situation, that's thrown a new curveball at us, which limits our ability to put more than one person in a vehicle because of spatial requirements and social distancing requirements. So we've working through how we operationalise this in the context of getting our people out on the ground. in the broader context of how to get community involved and how to get community engaged and supporting the recovery effort. I spoke a number of weeks ago about opening the opportunity up for volunteers and registering on the Park Care site on the web. That still exists. It's just that we're now confronted with a different dimension of how do we actually enable that to happen when we can't get groups of people or engage with community in the way that we've done in the past. And I guess we're exploring those sorts of opportunities through this type of format going forward. All right, on that note, I'm open to questions and working through and responding to a range of different questions from people.
Thanks, Ian. So just before we move to questions, and please feel free to jot your questions in the sidebar, or you can put your hand up. If people can turn their videos on for me, that would be awesome. If you can, would be great to see people's faces. All right, there's everybody there. We're going to come to Carissa in a minute, but as you've got your videos on, don't be shy. I'm going to take a photo. So actually, I'm going to take a photo of me taking a photo of the videos. So there you go, a room full of people. We'll throw that back at you later. Okay, so I'm just going to throw to Carissa Bruce. Carissa is the CEO of Landcare ACT, and she just wants to chat for a couple of minutes about some grant funding that Landcare ACT put an application in for, and then we'll come back to questions. So if you've got any questions that you'd like to start asking, please feel free to put them on the chat bar or put your hand up. And so far, I think this is working with videos on, so I think we can leave videos on for the moment, which might be nicer for the interaction part of the discussion. So over to you, Carissa.
Thanks, Helen. And excuse me, I'm using dual screens here, so I'm looking in two directions. So those of you who don't know me, my name's Carissa Bruce. I'm the CEO of Landcare ACT. So Landcare ACT, just in case you haven't heard of it, is the big body for landcare in the ACT. And so Landcare is, as most of you know, an enduring grassroots Australia-wide movement. And Landcare ACT assists in directing the community. It's basically directed by the community for the community to help care for our environment. So Landcare ACT has 5 foundation members. These are the Southern ACT Catchment Group, Ginninderra Catchment Group and Molonglo Catchment Group, as well as Buru, Ngunnawal Aboriginal Corporation and the Rural Landholders Association. So overall, Landcare ACT supports, promotes and leads over 60 community landcare groups to maintain and improve the health of local environments in the ACT region. So thank you, Ian, for your overview of the bushfire recovery process. Basically, just particularly Landcare ACT is interested in how in the bushfire recovery, and particularly given that the fires have burnt such significant habitat in Namadgi and in Tidbinbilla National Park, significant habitat for wildlife. And it's also areas that are well loved by the regional community, as well as some rural land. So I guess that's why Landcare ACT particularly is interested in this issue. We've been developing a program focused on bushfire recovery that enables the community and individual volunteers to participate. And so this is in addition to and value adding to the work that ACT government is doing that Ian was just talking about. So we've recently been successful in a grant application through Landcare Australia, which basically facilitates individuals to volunteer on on-ground restoration work. So as a bit of a background, early in the year, Landcare ACT held 2 forums. One was an internal one, and then the other was with external NGO stakeholders looking at, well, what can we do to assist in this bushfire recovery process? One of Landcare ACT's member groups, Southern ACT Catchment Group, developed a register for interested volunteers, and within a very short amount of time, they got over 550 volunteers who signed up to help in this bushfire recovery process. Since then, we've had many more volunteers who have signed up, both through the Southern ACT Catchment Group register, but also through Landcare Australia. And so now Landcare ACT is working with the ACT government and doing some liaison on to how we can work best with community and the government to do this bushfire recovery process. So the key focus that Landcare ACT has is facilitating these 550 new volunteers, which is in addition to the existing 60 groups who want to help do this work, to do restoration activities. So this will involve weed management, habitat restoration, including nest boxes, sediment control, riparian restoration, and hopefully some flora and fauna assessments and water quality monitoring. And as Ian said, the fence repair is also important, and some people have been putting their hand up to repair fences that were damaged either by the fire or in the significant rainfall events that happened after the fire. So we're also liaising with Conservation Volunteers Australia, who received quite a significant amount of money to look at ensuring that the risk of volunteers engaging in bushfire recovery across the whole nation is done well. So we're working together with them. And so I guess we're initially starting small with this Landcare Australia grant, but we are also looking at the rapid assessment that was done and how the community land carers can assist and participate in that recovery effort as well. So as Ian said, we're also a little unsure how we're going to move this forward in this era of COVID-19, and we'll be looking at innovative ways to do it, as well as just happy to wait until the lockdown finishes. So if people are interested, obviously you can sign up through the Park Care Hub, as Ian mentioned, and there is also a register with Southern ACT Catchment Group that you can participate in, so feel free to sign up with both if you'd like to. That's probably all from me. Thanks, Helen.
Thanks, Carissa. So I've got some questions coming in, which I'll get to in a minute. But I guess I just wanted to kick off with the first question, which you both alluded to in terms of the response. And I guess I'm just wondering about what the risks are in terms of the response being delayed if we do see a significant delay in being able to get in and do the work that is required. Where would those main risks be?
Helen, I think the key risk that I'm seeing is the inability to get community into the landscape and helping with that. We know that out of many fire and fire recovery efforts, getting community involved and participating in the recovery both helps the community groups, gives them a sense of purpose and opportunity, and that's going to be a gap, because I'm not sure how we do that well in the context of COVID-19. In terms of the delivery of works, you think about the sorts of activities that we undertake, and you think about things like pest animal control, pest plant control. Our staff and our contractors are able to deliver that program and that work now. So it's not, and they can do that with appropriate social distancing in play. It just means we might have to have 2 vehicles out doing that to carry 2 people, as opposed to 1 vehicle carrying 2 people. So they're the sorts of things that are now being tested and put in place. Likewise, the discussions with our contractors, also having those same sorts of discussions about, okay, you're engaged to do the fencing work. How do you do that, recognising and being aware that we don't want to spread COVID-19 around. So I think what we'll see is a range of different approaches to get people into the space, but the techniques of delivering that work are still exactly the same, and they are done by relatively small teams anyway.
Okay, thanks, Ian. All right, do people want to ask their own questions that are in the question bar? So if I throw to Michelle, would you like to ask your question? Not sure if this is going to work.
Hello?
Yep, go for it. Floor's yours.
Just quickly, so has there been an evaluation of the effectiveness of containment lines? I'm wondering if we need more and bigger fire trails to increase our capacity to control fire.
Thanks, Michelle. After all fires, and this goes back, not just to this recent event, the effectiveness of containment lines is clearly evident and it's recognised that they work. The challenge with containment lines is that when the weather is extreme, no containment line will stop a fire, irrespective of how big it is. Experience from these fires, and I say that in the broader Australian context, in New South Wales they had containment lines that were extremely wide, and the fire during those extreme weather events just went straight over the top of them without even noticing them. So under extreme conditions, no containment line will pull up a fire. What containment lines do, however, do is provide firefighters with the opportunity to prevent the spread in less extreme conditions, and also provide important access to sites that may not otherwise be able to be accessed. We're fortunate in the ACT that we do have a good trail network, and that trail network is maintained, and we utilise that extensively to respond to fire events. One of the key areas of difficulty for us in these fires were on the western side of the ACT, where we had less containment lines for a very important reason. They were key catchment areas. So that was more problematic, but certainly we know that containment lines work. We also know that they don't work under extreme conditions.
Sorry, thanks, Anne. I've just got one question from the chat line, which is from Alison, which she just wanted to know, did the lunar laser ranger on the ridge above the Orroral Valley survive the fire? The lunar laser range?
Yes, I believe it did, and I might get some confirmation for you on that, but my understanding was yes, that is it's still intact.
Okay, thank you. And then I'm just going to throw to Kate Lyle, who's got a question as well.
Hi, can you hear me all right?
Really well.
Okay, just curious, what with the massive funding that is happening from the government with regards to COVID-19, whether this is likely to impact even previously given grants or other funding that the directorate was planning to use for the recovery efforts?
Good question, and a difficult question to answer because we don't know where COVID's going to end up. We certainly can, so grants that have been allocated, they will continue. We are confident that the Commonwealth will continue to invest in recovery effort across the country. They have set up a recovery entity, so that group will make decisions about where to invest funding. I'm confident from the ACT's point of view that we will be able to invest in works, and the key part of that, and why the rapid risk assessment work is important, is that it actually gives us a sense of where the priority areas are. So we will invest. It just becomes then a question of which priorities do we work our way through. I would also say we have been very fortunate, and this might sound odd, that the environment that has been burnt is predominantly in the park environment, and we know that it will recover and recover well without a lot of intervention unless we've done something to prevent it recovering in the first place. And by that I mean, you know, we've put a control line in the wrong place, or we've done something to that effect. We know that in the main it will recover pretty well, and the fact that we've got a mosaic of fire intensity across the landscape gives me even further confidence that the environment will recover. We need to help it, and the key things around pest plants, pest animals, erosion control are the key things from an ecological point of view that we need to put in place.
Thank you.
So sorry, my dog's barking, so I'm going to quickly throw it to Julie, who's got a question about fire retardant.
Hi, thanks for that. I was just wondering, Ian, whether there's been any specific work done on how the fire retardant has affected the vegetation, if at all, and whether there's going to be any sort of long-term monitoring on that. Thanks.
Sure. So we know that fire retardant is a phosphate-based chemical. We do know that we want to mitigate its application in proximity to waterways. So key strategy in fire management is not to put retardant so that you end up with retardant going into waterways. We also know that putting retardant into heathland environments is not good either. So a key strategy has been to limit the use of retardant in the natural environment. You may have seen on the fly-through significant retardant lines on the boundary of the park between the park and Tharwa on rural lands. That, I guess, demonstrates that sort of intent that we wanted to keep and minimise the use of retardant in the park. There was a decision made to use retardant to prevent the fire from going into Giannini wetlands. That was a very conscious decision that we made around, okay, if we need to protect the Ramsar wetland, we needed to deploy some way of doing that. And in that environment, we had very little choice of what other options we could do. So that occurred. To go to your next question about what will the impact be on the vegetation, that's the very process of the recovery stage and the monitoring and evaluation that forms part of the recovery. I didn't mention in the presentation, I guess, the key principles that will support our overall and focused recovery effort. And they relate to a couple of key things. So natural processes, support natural processes and make sure that we're doing that. Use evidence-based information to inform our decision-making. So ensuring that we've got good research at the front end and we're evaluating and monitoring throughout the process and at the back end. Ensuring that we're engaging with traditional custodians and building climate change and resilience into the whole recovery effort. And I guess I've previously used the example of the corroboree frogs. We know we can breed frogs. We are doing that at Tidbinbilla. We know we can put them into the landscape at appropriate locations. Our challenge is I can't make the mountain any taller to keep the same sort of temperature regime that the frogs need. So what strategies do we put in place to enable things like corroboree frogs to continue to exist in the landscape when our environment through climate change is changing?
Thanks, Ian. I'm just going to throw to Deb, Deb Kellick from Waterwatch. But before we did, there was just a comment here about the phosphate levels that were at extreme levels along the Murrumbidgee and Gudgeonby rivers in mid-February. I'm assuming was that being put down to the fire retardant?
No, that'd be the ash as well.
Oh, that's the ash, okay.
As well, or as likely as I have no idea about the fire retardant impact.
Yeah, that was a comment from someone.
Yeah, so that's Martin Lind, he's the Southern ACT Waterwatch Coordinator. Yep. How I became a Waterwatch Coordinator is volunteering. So I still volunteer down south, and the Gudgeonby was in a really horrendous state. And so I've got my data sheet sitting beside me here. I went to test on the 16th of February, and that happened to be just when that awful, awful black sludge came through the Gudgeonby and into the Murrumbidgee just south of Tharwa. But then when I tested, and just horrendous, we couldn't test the values, were just off the scale for turbidity, how murky the water is. It was black, it was just horrendous, and the smell of soot and everything, but also the phosphorus levels right off the scale. But Ian, I was just interested in that time frame that you were mentioning. So the water did run clear. I'm not sure how quickly, but 5 weeks later, the water was certainly so much clearer. Not so much in the Murrumbidgee, but the Gudgeonby was so much clearer. In even though there's all the black sludge still running along the, you know, metres up the sides of the bank, but the phosphorus levels were still degraded, and I'll be interested to see what they are in April. And yeah, so just because your comment about them running clear really quickly, I just wanted to point out that actually those nutrient levels, the phosphorus levels, very high still.
Yeah, certainly take that point. The nutrient levels will remain high, and over time we will see that drop as we see, you know, the sediments drop out of the system as well. So I don't have a good answer around how long that will take, and I guess that comes to the importance of Waterwatch and monitoring that. So that information becomes very important as we move forward, going, the phosphate levels have peaked, one would hope, and now they're on a decline. So I think that's the very reason we have Waterwatch, and we can get Waterwatch community out there doing work, albeit with the COVID-19 over our, I guess, having to deal with that as well.
Yeah. So I've actually been reading an email trail this afternoon with park carers pushing to get individual park carers able to be doing weeding and what have you in on their own, but there's a really strong case for Waterwatch. So I'm looking forward to Woo making that strong case to you, Ian, because our volunteers, they have their own kits. They're often, a lot of them are testing on their own properties or whatever, going to remote locations, not going to public areas. There's very few sites. And there's not that many people who are in a team where it's not a family member who they're going with. So I think there's a really strong case, and I think there's a really high priority for needing to get in there very quickly. And just as to the long-term fire impacts, Martin from Southern ACT, the Waterwatch coordinator who's listening, so he's the Southern SACT person who's listening here, might be able to talk about the Cotter and those long-term impacts on fire in the Cotter, because I think that really the impacts are still even evident now in terms of the water bugs. And yeah, so Martin, are you there? Can you unmute yourself? And I might mute myself now.
You're right. It's up to Helen.
Yeah, go for your life, Martin. We'll throw it straight to you. That's all right.
No worries. Look, I do have a professional working up in the Cotter catchment, the Upper Cotter, which is Bernie Brown from Parks and Conservation, and I'm yet to get some data back from her. So hopefully she'll have the Cotter covered. We have a little bit of information coming out of the Lower Cotter, but unfortunately it tends to be, the information we get from there tends to be fairly tainted with the Paddy's River catchment below the confluence at the Cotter campground. So we'll wait and see. We haven't got a lot of information out of the Cotter yet. Certainly a lot out of the Paddies, and certainly a lot out of the Gudgeonby and Murrumbidgee, thanks to you and others.
Thanks, Martin. I'm just going to throw to Gordon now, who's got a question, climate-related question. Gordon McAllister.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, obviously the bush can recover quite well over time, but my understanding is that the sort of environment around here needs at least 10 years between bushfires to get a good recovery. And I'm just a bit worried that with climate change, you know, there are predictions of more frequent bushfires and droughts, etc. I'm just wondering, you know, if the frequency of bushfires starts increasing below 10 years, 5 years or whatever, what do you think will be the long-term impact on the park?
So a couple of different ways of answering that question. The landscape will change, as it always has done over time. With climate change, we will see more frequent fires, so we will see vegetation communities changing over that time. We'll also see areas of refuge or refugia that remain, and they will be, I guess, areas that continue to provide the existing vegetation types, existing fauna. So we're going to see change. And I guess part of our collective challenge is to go, well, what will that look like and how do we respond to that? And that's part of our recovery work. And we'll be calling on experts and scientists from a range of institutions to help us work through, okay, what might those vegetation types look like? My experience in Victoria with alpine ash, we know that alpine ash requires fire to set seed. We also know that it takes 20 years before the trees mature to be able to set seed, and therefore if you have a fire under 20 years more than once, you end up with no trees that are able to produce seed, and therefore alpine ash is lost from the landscape. Climate modelling has already told us that, so we know some of these things already, and the question becomes, okay, so what's that vegetation type replaced with, and what does that look like going forward? So we know we're going to have to deal with a different type of vegetation, and I guess what we do with that is then, okay, what's changed? Does it still provide the ecosystem service, the ecosystem function that enables particular animals or environmental function to continue?
I'm just going to follow, just skip a couple of questions and go to Gerard Dwyer, who's just got a question that sort of follows on from that, I think. Over to you, Gerard.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Yeah, I'm just really interested in the areas that I've seen around Mount Clear and other areas that hadn't actually been burnt in any of the historical terms that we knew of. And I know that now they're the first time that they have been recently burnt. I know the fires weren't too severe there as far as I can tell. I was just wondering what sort of observations have been taken of those areas, or what follow-up might be done relative to other surveys that have been done on reptile abundance and other different things that have been done in the past, to see how that changes an ecosystem that we'd never seen change like we just have, sadly.
So almost follows the same response I just gave, in that, you know, we are going to see some of these changes, and we will have seen areas that have been long unburnt burnt. That change, we are putting in place monitoring regimes to pick up what that change looks like, and also what that looks like into the future. So that will include vegetation responses, but also flora, fauna responses as well. It's a good question, and we're certainly turning our minds to, okay, how do we pick up that change, and what would that look like? We already know where those areas are, where they're long unburnt and or have been recently burnt from that sort of mapping the work that we've done over the last decade or so.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks, Ian. If I can just throw one in there. I was just curious to know, given that this fire has been quite significant in Namadgi, what are the processes around potentially reviewing, updating, or looking at the bushfire management
plan?
Yeah, thanks. Sorry.
That wasn't a very predictable question, Helen. Goodness.
Oh, well, you know, nobody else has got to it yet, so.
Yeah, look, so for those that are not aware of the situation, EPSDD produces an annual bushfire operations plan, which describes the areas to be fuel managed either through prescribed burning, slashing, grazing, and other activities. So that's produced annually, and it describes the work that we do. In addition to that, we use what's called Phoenix modelling, and that basically is a simulation of lots of fires across the landscape, some 5,000 across the ACT, and from that you can determine where fires would spread and their impact on life and property, ecological values and catchment values. And that gives us a tool to target where we would undertake fuel reduction activities. And that's a very significant step for the ACT. It gives us the ability to really target where those activities are undertaken, given our window of burning and fuel management regimes is changing under climate. It gives us an ability to focus that. What that work does show is that we needed to reduce fuel in a number of areas in Namadgi National Park, and we'd been unable to do a number of those areas in the last year. Now, in the context of where we are, those areas have now been burnt. So we do have to redo our bushfire operations plan, and we're turning our mind to that now. And the focus of the bushfire operations plan, likely into next year, will certainly be to the west of Canberra and in and around the urban interface.
Thanks for that. I'm guessing that one of the challenges we face in terms of climate change going forward, obviously, is using, what, for want of a better word, hazard reduction burning, because the windows are shrinking due to climate change. What are the other mechanisms that are easily available that are replacement strategies for that?
So at scale, we have really only the use of fire as a key strategy at scale. And by scale, I mean at tens of thousands of hectares scale. We do have smaller techniques around the use of strategic grazing, of slashing, of removing fuel using basically machinery and or people. So that really is the only options available to us at the moment. There are things like what's called trittering, which is effectively mulching. So much more, has a different impact on the environment than, let's say, a burn. But those sorts of techniques are available to us. The important bit, though, I would say for everyone listening, is that the use of the modelling and the identification of priority areas to burn that have the greatest impact on life and property means that with a smaller window of opportunity, we're actually targeting the right areas. And I think that's a really important message for the community to hear, is that as our window gets smaller, we need to focus and make sure we're reducing fuel in the right areas that will have the greatest impact. And working with ESA across the Parks and Conservation Service, that's where we're putting our energy.
Sorry, unmute. Thanks, Ian. Just going to throw to Jackie, who's got a question about volunteers. Jackie, you there? Might need to unmute yourself. Or I can do it.
I was pressing the space bar and I thought that worked, but it obviously doesn't all the time. I'm still getting to know all the little fine, fine.
I'm sorry, I could have offered to do it for you.
Of Zoom. Yeah, so I suppose my question, Deb answered it to some degree, but I guess I just wanted to get a bit of a sense of what was the kind of range of activities that had been envisaged being undertaken by volunteers before the new challenge of COVID-19 landed.
Yeah. And some of that has already been picked up, Jackie, but certainly things like monitoring, both the water watch space, flora and fauna monitoring. The Gudgeonby bush regenerators did significant work after 2003, regenerating bogs and fens. Had a mental blank then. So they'd already pretty much come to the table saying, hey, we're ready to go, get us in there, make that happen. So we need to think about, okay, how does that happen now under this COVID-19 lens? Through to, planting, spraying weeds, a whole range of those sorts of activities. Traditional custodians, they're playing a particularly significant role around recognising cultural values and the protection of country. So they play a significant role there. And as a vulnerable community, that's even more of a challenge. Without offending people on the video conference, a lot of our volunteers are in the more vulnerable age bracket. So we've got a number of things that we're not going to need to consider about how to move forward with our volunteers. And those that have heard me speak before, have been engaged directly with me, I am fundamentally of the view that without volunteers supporting and conserving our natural environment, we don't have the capacity, capability in government to do this on our lonesome. So the whole COVID situation, we need to rethink and go, well, how can we do this now? What might it look like in a different world? And to be brutally honest, we're at that point of trying to work those things out.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm just going to throw to Ira now, who's got a question about Indigenous ranges.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, beautiful.
Oh, good. I'm a volunteer out at Tidbinbilla, and I know that one of the things that they have used in the past is the knowledge or the strategies that the Indigenous rangers used for fire and controlled burns and things. Are you also availing yourselves of those?
Thanks, Ira, for the question. So we have a traditional custodian committee that we've established here in Parks and Conservation Service in the Environment Division. That's made up of Ngunnawal elders, and they've been guiding us and providing advice and direction to us on how to manage the fire in the first instance, then how to progress through the fire recovery stages. That knowledge and that information is being then translated both to our Indigenous staff, but also to other staff in the Directorate, so that we can really build traditional knowledge and expertise into this space. We were, I guess, fortunate that we got the traditional custodians out onto country very early, before the media were out there, before many of the other people that wanted to go out onto country to look at the fire and the fire impacts. We took a busload of elders out to effectively heal and to give them a sense of, okay, what does this mean? How do we respond to that? And as I said, they've been really guiding us through the recovery stages, and we'll continue to utilise that group and other traditional custodians through this space, including our registered Aboriginal organisations, which have a legislative responsibility associated with the Heritage Act.
Thank you, that's great. Could I also ask another question while I'm here? The photograph that you had of the creek or the stream with lots of ash on the sort of side and all that, where was that?
I'm pretty sure it was Gudgeonby.
Oh, right, okay. Thank you.
Okay, I've got probably 2 more questions. If anyone else has got another question, please jot it down now. At least just let me know that you'd like to ask it, so that I can get a sense of how many more we've got. So I'm just going to throw to Madeline Tranter, if you're there, if you'd like to ask your question. It's easy for Ian to hear them than read them.
My big take from all the bushfire season and this summer was that there was a huge, big interest from the general public and people that hadn't considered volunteering before and weren't helping out. There was the Water for Wildlife popped up, and suddenly everyone was concerned about the environment they forgot was on their doorstep. And so I'd already started thinking about ways to get them involved before COVID. But were there specific methods that you were looking at to get more people on board? And do you have any ideas for that going forward with COVID? Because obviously that's going to make things like the standard training for volunteers a bit more complicated.
Yes. So we've done a number of pre-COVID-19, we've run a number of sessions like this. We've highlighted that the Park Care website is the place to go to register for volunteers. So we've been actively sort of promoting that. So I guess that was pre-COVID-19. With COVID-19 coming into play, we're now at the point of going, okay, can we provide services like this to give the training or to provide guidance virtually to park care volunteers? And then you run into the, okay, we can send 1 or 2 people out in a vehicle provided their family, or in that sort of paired arrangement. And I think that's the next step for us to work through, is how to transition from a group of 10 people going out to groups of 1s or 2s that are self-contained, yet still from a health and safety well-being point of view, still have somebody there who, if something goes wrong, is able to support them.
Okay, thanks, Ian. I've got one last question from Deb again. I'm just going to throw to you, Deb. I think that's a pretty meaty question, so that will probably be our last one for the night.
Thanks, Helen. David Lindemeyer talks about in really extreme fire conditions, hazard reduction burning makes almost no difference, and that what really does help, though, is that burning on the urban fringe, and you talked about that before. And then given that, so you can have these the BOP plans, bushfire operational plans, but then we get wildfires and deliberately lit fires that have such a devastating impact and increase the frequency of burning in places that we don't want to burn and what have you. So is there still a strong case for hazard reduction burns, particularly in remote places?
So I'll probably answer it slightly differently, Deb. Hazard reduction burning is about achieving multiple objectives. So one objective is to reduce the fuel load, certainly. And as David said, in extreme weather, hazard reduction burning is less successful in stopping the spread of fire. In milder conditions, it pulls a fire up and it means you can control it. In the fire in the ACT, you can see literally where the fire has gone around hazard reduction burns, fuel reduced areas. You can see that the fire has not gone into those areas but moved around that particular burn. So under milder conditions, they are extremely valuable. However, the other bit I'd mention is there are 2 other objectives that burns provide. One's about an ecological objective. So burns are not just about reducing fuel, they're also about stimulating and enabling regeneration of plants and animals to occur. And that's an important aspect that we need to talk about and that we need to make sure is more explicit when we say we're undertaking a burn. The third objective in that is also about culture. So traditional custodians used fire to achieve multiple objectives. So they might have used it to help stimulate growth of certain plants, yams or other. They might have used fire to make access into particularly fertile areas for gathering food or for hunting, and providing that opportunity there. So our burnings are about those multiple objectives, and that was I think the point David was making when he spoke the other week. Use of fire is not just about a single objective, it's actually about achieving multiple things. The challenge is getting that balance right. Plants in particular have what's called vital attributes, so they have a range of which fire is tolerable or not tolerable. So in looking at vegetation communities, we want to try and make sure we're managing our fire across that community in the tolerable range so that we don't inadvertently remove that vegetation type from the landscape. And that's very much the focus of how we're trying to move forward.
Okay, thanks, Ian.
Okay, thanks, Deb. Thanks, Ian. Does anyone have any final questions before that you didn't get around to writing down, or that you didn't fancy writing down? Is there anything, any final comments that anyone has that I'd like to make before we wrap up? I should say, put your hand up in blue electronically, or forever hold your peace, or something like that. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much for all of your time this evening. You can see that it's gotten dark around us. Everyone's starting to look a slightly spooky images coming through on the internet there. We really appreciate your time. It's the first time we've done this. We've had up to 48, no, we had more than about 48 to 50 people in the room when we started. The beautiful thing about this method is you can leave the room when you need to. So we're down to 35 now. It's time for dinner. I'd like to extend a big thank you to Ian. If you can show your virtual appreciation for him, that would be fabulous. For his time this evening. I know that everybody in government is incredibly busy, incredibly stretched, and like all of us, just trying to regroup and figure out how to move forward. After what's been a really difficult bushfire season, followed by a really difficult health issue, I don't think in some ways those two things could have come more back to back and in a more challenging way if they had tried to. And I know that so many of you are busting to get out and do what you can do to contribute to the recovery down in Namadgi as much as we can, and also the rest of the region, which I know has also really been suffering. So thank you so much, Ian. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, Helen. Thank you, Helen.
We can do this again in a few months and maybe have 50 people in a room for you. So
that would be wonderful. Look, Helen, could I also thank everyone? It is a very different world we're in at the moment. Doing this virtually is novel, and I think we're having to take some steps that are remarkable in everyone's lifetime in terms of how community is needing to deal with this. So I just want to re-emphasise those messages that government's been giving about social distancing, about staying home, about not travelling, only for essential travel. So these sorts of messages are really important. As I said, the majority of our workforce is now working from home. We're in constant contact delivering effectively our services as we need to, and obviously getting out into the field to deliver work on the ground. But I'm very interested to hear from all of you about how we emerge post-COVID-19. One of our challenges is how do we keep a community engaged during this period of time, and how do we come out of it at the other end? And to me, that's going to be equally challenging as people have been isolated to some degree. How do we now reactivate community, get people involved in looking after the environment? And I'm open to any and all ideas on that. So reaching out to you for your help and your assistance. Thank you again.
Thanks, Ian. All right, thank you again, everybody. The Conservation Council, as you know, our offices have closed 2 weeks ago, but the team is still working remotely. Maddie Clegg, who might be in the middle of your screen, she's looking particularly gloomy there, is waving, is our new biodiversity campaigner, and I'm sure that many of you may come across her over the next few weeks and months as she engages in liaison around policy and the development of our policy leading into the ACT election, which may or may not happen in October, depending on all of the interesting repercussions of what we're going through at the moment. So, so thank you to Maddie for her work and support on these issues. And thank you to all of you for your efforts and the care that you put into our environment. We are still working. We're a little bit low key at the moment, but it is, as we say, not quite business as usual, which is our kind of new hashtag at the moment, hashtag not quite business as usual. But we do look forward to seeing you again, perhaps at another forum in the future. So thank you for your time tonight. I'm going to press the magic end meeting button, which will end it for all of you. So on that note, have a good evening. Thanks a lot. Bye.